Subscribe to the Survival Record if you value the kind of history that looks past the battlefield maps and into the lived mechanics of survival. Because one of the lesser-known realities of the Second World War is this: many of the techniques that kept soldiers alive were never written into public manuals, never advertised in newspapers, and rarely discussed after the war. They were passed quietly from veteran to recruit, from platoon to platoon, and in some cases deliberately withheld from civilians, not because they were glamorous, but because they revealed just how thin the margin between life and death really was. The popular memory of World War II focuses on grand strategy, armored thrusts, air campaigns, amphibious invasions. But survival at the individual level was often determined by small, disciplined practices. These were hacks in the truest sense, improvised, field-adapted, and shaped by hard experience. And many of them influenced military doctrine long after 1945, even if civilians were never formally told. Let's look at 7 of them, not as curiosities, but as lessons in endurance, adaptation, and preparation. The first lesson soldiers learned was that staying dry was often more important than staying armed. In both the European and Pacific theatres, exposure killed with a quiet efficiency that enemy fire could not match. On the Eastern Front, German and Soviet troops alike learned that wet clothing in sub-freezing temperatures meant immobilization within hours. During the winter following Operation Barbarossa, German units discovered that inadequate winter gear could render entire formations combat ineffective before an enemy engagement even began. Veteran infantrymen developed strict routines around moisture control. Boots were rotated whenever possible. Socks were dried inside shirts during marches. Sleeping positions were chosen not for comfort, but for drainage. In the Pacific, United States Marines fighting on islands like Guadalcanal learned to construct raised sleeping platforms from scrap wood and ammunition crates to prevent trench foot and fungal infections. These habits later informed formal cold weather and jungle warfare training. Today's military survival manuals emphasize moisture management as foundational. The civilian outdoor community learned similar lessons decades later, but during the war it was institutional knowledge born of preventable losses. Camouflage was not about hiding from sight, but about disrupting patterns. Hollywood portrays camouflage as a matter of color. World War II soldiers understood it as a matter of shape and behavior. Snipers and reconnaissance units in armies, such as the United States Marine Corps and the Wehrmacht, learned that the human silhouette was more dangerous than bright fabric. Helmets were covered with netting, not simply to reduce shine, but to break the smooth dome that the eye instinctively recognizes. Equipment was rearranged to eliminate straight lines. Movement occurred in irregular intervals. A man walking at a steady pace across broken terrain was easier to detect than one who paused unpredictably. In the Pacific, some Japanese units trained soldiers to freeze entirely when aircraft passed overhead, even if caught mid-stride. This principle, pattern disruption over concealment, became foundational in post-war reconnaissance doctrine. Modern camouflage theory continues to focus on shape distortion and behavioral discipline, not just coloration. Rations were stretched not by eating less, but by changing when and how soldiers ate. Official ration systems were designed on paper. In practice, frontline troops often modified consumption to match combat realities. During the Italian campaign and after the D-Day landings in Normandy, United States infantry units learned quickly that large meals before engagement increased fatigue and reduced alertness. Veterans began dividing rations into smaller time portions, maintaining stable energy rather than enduring spikes and crashes. Chocolate and sugar components were reserved for moments immediately before expected exertion. Coffee was rationed not socially, but tactically. German and Soviet troops on the Eastern Front sometimes pooled rations at squad level, redistributing based on immediate need rather than strict individual allotment. This informal micro-logistics system reduced collapse in extreme cold. The lesson is not simply about food scarcity, It reflects an understanding that survival under stress depends on metabolic management. Modern military nutrition science formalized many of these principles decades later. Silence was treated as a survival tool, not merely a discipline. Noise discipline is now a formal military concept. In World War II, it was refined through painful experience. Patrols operating behind enemy lines learned that metallic clinks, canteens, mess kits, loose ammunition were often what betrayed them. Units adapted by wrapping equipment in cloth, taping loose metal, and adjusting marching intervals to prevent accidental collisions. In dense jungle fighting against the Imperial Japanese Army, American forces learned that sound carried unpredictably in humid air. Conversations were replaced by touch signals and prearranged gestures. German reconnaissance patrols on the Western Front similarly trained soldiers to communicate through minimal physical cues. These practices directly influenced post-war special operations training. What began as field improvisation became codified stealth doctrine. For civilians, the deeper lesson is that survival often depends on environmental awareness. Sound, more than sight, frequently determined outcomes. Digging was, a form of insurance against both enemy fire and the weather. Entrenchment is ancient, but the Second World War really transformed it into a science of personal survival. Soldiers quickly understood that shallow foxholes just weren't enough against artillery fragmentation. Veterans, they deepened positions beyond regulation depth and added overhead cover whenever possible. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops fighting in the defense of cities like the Battle of Stalingrad reinforced dugouts with scavenged timber and debris to withstand both shelling and that brutal winter wind. In North Africa, British and German units dug not only for protection from fire, but also from temperature extremes. Sand provided insulation during those cold, desert nights. The practice of improving fighting positions during every lull became almost instinctively second nature. This constant reinforcement culture influenced modern field engineering standards. It also reinforced a psychological truth. Preparation during quiet moments determines survival during violent ones. Equipment was modified constantly, even when, honestly, regulations discouraged it. Standardization is essential for military logistics, but Second World War soldiers frequently altered issued gear to suit survival realities. Paratroopers in the 101st Airborne Division cut down straps to reduce snag hazards. Infantrymen replaced heavy steel helmet liners with improvised padding for those long marches. Soviet troops adapted captured German equipment when it actually proved more suitable for winter. In the Pacific, Marines shortened rifle slings and waterproofed ammunition pouches with wax and grease, going well beyond official recommendations. These changes were rarely publicized and sometimes even officially frowned upon. But, they spread informally because they worked. After the war, many of these field-driven modifications informed design improvements. Military procurement systems gradually incorporated lessons first discovered at platoon level. The broader implication is that survival knowledge often emerges from the bottom up. Psychological routines were treated as essential survival mechanisms. Combat fatigue, what we now understand as a spectrum of trauma responses, was widespread. But soldiers developed coping structures long before psychology formalized them. Units established small rituals, brewing coffee at fixed times, maintaining grooming standards even in forward areas, writing letters regularly. During prolonged campaigns, such as the island-hopping operations in the Pacific, and the grinding attrition following Operation Overlord, these routines preserved a sense of order. German and Allied forces alike rotated units off the line whenever possible, not merely for rest, but to prevent psychological collapse. These practices later influenced structured rest and recovery cycles in modern armed forces. The recognition that mental resilience is as critical as ammunition was, honestly, hard won. It remains relevant for anyone studying long-term crisis endurance. Improvised medical knowledge spread faster than official doctrine. Frontline medics and ordinary soldiers alike adapted rapidly when official medical support lagged behind battlefield realities. In North Africa and Italy, soldiers learned to treat dehydration aggressively before collapse occurred. In jungle theaters, early cleaning of minor wounds became routine to prevent infection in humid climates. Field expedient tourniquet use and rapid bandaging practices were refined through necessity. Although modern trauma care has advanced dramatically, the principle that immediate action saves lives was reinforced repeatedly during the Second World War. Many civilian emergency response techniques trace their lineage back to wartime adaptation. Yet at the time, much of this knowledge circulated informally within units rather than through public channels. World War II is often remembered for its scale, armies of millions, continents in conflict. But really, survival came down to habits measured in inches and minutes: staying dry, breaking your silhouette, eating strategically, moving silently, digging deeper, modifying equipment, protecting mental endurance, acting medically without hesitation. These were not dramatic innovations. They were quiet corrections to human vulnerability under extreme conditions, and because they revealed weaknesses in planning, supply, and doctrine, they were rarely celebrated publicly. Understanding these survival hacks matters because they remind us that large systems, governments, armies, industries, are ultimately tested at the level of individual endurance. Wars are not sustained by strategy alone. They are sustained by small, disciplined behaviors repeated under stress. If you value this kind of grounded, in-depth historical analysis, subscribe to the Survival Record and share this video with others who want more than surface-level summaries. These stories deserve to be remembered, not for spectacle, but for the lessons they still carry.